Fort Fremont closes out a 350-year legacy of coastal fortifications in Port Royal Sound, beginning in the mid-16th century. It also represents the closing chapter of America's coastal defense system before the dawn of air power. Fort Fremont is an example of the most advanced military technology of its time. It would parallel the B-17, an aircraft carrier of World War II, the F-35 of today. Fort Fremont was an important part of the Beaufort culture, very similar to Paris Island and the Marine Corps Air Base today.
In 1525, the Spaniards named this sound and this harbor Santa Elena. They called the navigational point La Punta de Santa Elena, the point of Santa Elena. And what the Spanish explorers discovered is that Port Royal Sound is a unique piece of geography. It's the deepest natural harbor south of the Chesapeake Bay, possibly south of New York. The channel into Port Royal Sound, this I find a remarkable geological fact. The channel has not changed for 500 years. There's no inlet on the southern coast that hasn't shifted entirely in 500 years, except Port Royal Sound. There's something geologically different, or one might say magical, about Port Royal Sound. So Spanish sailors, being the best in the world in their time, found this place very early, knew that for the Spanish explorations of the American Southeast, this would be the entrada, the entrance. And so they built a city across the river, across the sound from where we are on Paris Island. It became the first capital of Florida. And they explored the backcountry from this location for more than a century with the object of building a highway from this magnificent harbor to Mexico City. So the Sound was known to the Spaniards. It was known to the French, who actually got here first and created the first Protestant colony in the New World on Paris Island over my shoulder. And that colony was a failure. The Spaniards replaced them. It was part of Spanish Florida when the English arrived 150 years later. And this became, as a consequence, a battleground in the 18th century between Spanish interests in Florida and St. Augustine and the English colony in Carolina and in Charleston. And back and forth these wars went, many of them naval wars, many of them employing, as all the sailors knew by then, the magic of Port Royal Sound. When the Civil War came, Confederates defended the harbor, but it was basically indefensible against large naval forces. So the U.S. Navy made it their principal target during the beginning of the Civil War and sent the largest flotilla of ships assembled by the United States Navy in the 19th century into Port Royal Sound on November 7th, 1861. In a 4-hour cannonade, which would have been deafening from where we're sitting, was heard for miles from Savannah nearly to Charleston. It was called the Day of the Big Gun Shoot. During the Civil War, this harbor that we're looking at was filled with ships. There would be hundreds of ships in this harbor. There was a 1,000-foot dock with a railroad on top off of Hilton Head. The military installation was mammoth. There were 13,000 U.S. soldiers on Hilton Head, which we're looking at. The largest population on Hilton Head until 1974. So this was a major U.S. government installation in the heart of the South. It was the headquarters of the U.S. Army Department of the South, but more importantly, it was the headquarters of the United States Navy South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So the biggest ships in the Navy were here. And so it became, and that's really where the story of Fort Fremont starts, with that huge Civil War military operations and installations on Hilton Head, on St. Helena Island, on Paris Island, and in Beaufort.
After the Civil War, we're going to see a massive change in technology that's going to revolutionize the military. During the Civil War, we had ironclad ships, we had rifled cannons, but they were all made out of iron, and they were not terribly effective. But its technology is going to change after the Civil War. We're going to see steel produced, and steel is much harder. So now we have a new material to make armor out of for ships. So we can have these armored ships made with steel that are much more resistant to shot. Because I have steel, I can make stronger barrels for my guns. I can rifle and machine these much better, and the rifling is the spirals that are cut in the barrel that allows it to shoot further with more accuracy. And we can also now have breech loading guns that can lock from behind, so I can load my gun from behind. I don't have to go have the old black powder muzzle loading cannon that I had before. Now I can fire much more rapidly. If I compare the gun of 1890 to the guns of 1860, for the same caliber, the same diameter gun, the 1890 gun will be able to fire a projectile that's 4 times heavier, can shoot it 3 times further, can put it in with greater precision, and can put it through much more armor than anything we had in 1860. It's a world difference. A military historian, E.R. Lewis, would say that the change between the Civil War and 1890 in artillery technology was the greatest that would be seen since invention of artillery in the 14th century to the introduction of the nuclear projectile in the 1950s. So there's been a huge change in gun technology. At the same time, it's not just the steel, but also the powder that fires these guns is different. We have new chemical makeup, and sort of like cordite is invented now, and it's still a widely used military explosive even today. Smokeless powder is invented during this period of time. And it's not just chemical composition, but it's the details of how you make the grain, how fast they burn. So much like the skill of firing a solid rocket, solid fuel rocket, it's that same kind of technology that's been developed in these gunpowder and this new powder. So our weapons of this day are much, much greater. They would be the great killing machines of World War I. Most of the casualties on the battlefields of World War I would come from artillery. So the world has seen a huge change in artillery, and that's tied into changes in ships. We now have steel armored ships. They're all steam powered. They are now equipped with these fine long-range guns, and they now become the dominant threat of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the threat. The French and the English would bombard cities like Cairo and reduce them to rubble because they were unable to defend them. So this is how the world was seeing the threat from this new technology. Big battleships are the threat of the era, and new guns and fortifications on the ground are what you have to defend against them.
One of the most important and first things that happened after the Civil War is they built a railroad to Port Royal Sound, which didn't exist. It was the first connection of the Sea Islands to the mainland. The advantage of that railroad is it brought coal to Port Royal Sound. So when the coal was delivered, the Navy followed.
In 1872, Robert Smalls was in the South Carolina legislature, and he pushed through a resolution to the Secretary of War calling for them to put a Navy station on Paris Island. And eventually he would go on to Congress, where he would continue his support for a Navy station here in the Beaufort Port Royal area. They eventually opened a Navy station here and a coaling station.
They created in the 1890s on Paris Island the largest dry dock in the United States. This is the period when the U.S. Navy was switching from sail to steam. All the navies of the world needed a coaling station. This was the principal coaling station, because of the railroad, for the Caribbean and South American U.S. fleets.
This would be the biggest dry dock south of Norfolk. In fact, it is the only dry dock south of Norfolk, Virginia, that's capable of taking these new modern battleships and these new modern armored cruisers. So this becomes, at this point, a strategic Navy base in that it provides coal, and it provides top-line support to the ships, and they can repair the hulls of even the biggest ships in the U.S. Navy. Following the Civil War, national strategy and emphasis in the United States shifted to recovery from war, and all of our coastal fortifications went into neglect. The military was busy taming the West, and coastal defenses became something that was no longer important. In the rest of the world, technology is moving forward, and they're developing these battleships, they're developing new high-quality artillery, and this is going on worldwide. And in 1885, President Grover Cleveland appointed the Endicott Board. This was headed by Secretary of War Endicott, William Endicott, and the board would meet and issue a report in 1886, and they said the conditions of our coastal defenses were just unbearable. They could not be allowed to stay like that. and they made recommendations for fortification and improvements. They identified 29 places that needed fortifications, and 11 of which were critical. In that list of 29, Savannah and Charleston are on the list, but Beaufort is not on the list. It'll take international events to bring Beaufort into the play of modern fort technology.
So the USS Maine was here on patrol and in the harbor, and while they were in the harbor several times, they entertained the local population. So the merchants and the social leaders and the political leaders of Beaufort were invited to come have lunch with the captain of the ship, Captain Sigsbee. And the officers got to know the people got to know the officers. The crew, which was large, would go ashore on payday and make friends with everybody in town. So it was a very social arrangement between the towns, Port Royal and Beaufort, and the ship. So the Maine left here. It went and refueled in Key West, and then went the 90 miles across to Havana into the harbor and blew up.
This inflamed the already hot passions both in Cuba and here in the United States. At that point, somebody in the War Department realized that we had this big dry dock, the only dry dock in the South that could take on and repair these big capital ships that were in our Navy. We were going to start operations against a power in the Caribbean, and this fort was totally undefended. And that's what put Fort Fremont on the map. We had to have a fort here to defend the coaling station and especially this big dry dock, as well as this fine harbor that's here.
And of course, that event, which killed 300 or more sailors on the ship, was very much followed by the local news media and very much lamented by the many friends that the crew had made here. The destruction of the USS Maine was a personal matter to Beaufort and to Port Royal Sound. And of course, it was the Spanish-American War and the attempt to defend this harbor again, which led to the creation of Fort Fremont. The United States declared war on Spain in April 1898.
And by early May, we had temporary batteries in place here, submarine mines were in place, and in the summer they would actually place the mines across the Beaufort River behind me. The temporary batteries were a temporary expedient. They were located to my left about 1,000 yards. They immediately began construction of what would become Fort Fremont. The large batteries would house the large guns. Battery 4 Nance, the rapid-fire guns, the smaller battery, was completed by June of 1898.
In 1898, everybody in town went to war. They had a naval militia unit, South Carolina Naval Militia Unit, and they were absorbed by the Navy. Many of them ran tugboats from here to New York to Key West, which was the principal support base, Tampa and Key West, for the U.S. Army operations in Cuba.
Peace was declared by the end of 1898, and the remainder of Fort Fremont would not be finished until early 1899, and the first soldiers would arrive from the regular Army at that point in March 1899.
Well, Fort Fremont was named for Major General John Fremont. He was actually a local boy, so to speak. He was born and grew up in Savannah, Georgia, just south of us, and went to college in the College of Charleston, up just north of us in Charleston. He served in the Army, and primarily initially as a explorer, as Army forts were generally named for Army officers, and he was connected locally. This is more than likely why the fort was named for him.
The fort was constructed on a site directly across the river from the Paris Island Naval Station. And the site selected was 170 acres, which included the two artillery batteries. Fort Fremont, of course, had Battery Fornes and Battery Jessup. But then adjacent to the battery site was an administrative quadrangle, a very typical military type administrative square.
We are sitting in the number 3 gun position of a 3-gun battery, Battery Jessup, which had 3 10-inch disappearing carriage, large caliber guns, breech-loading guns. Their purpose was to engage the warships that might be entering the harbor and Port Royal Sound. We're here now at the 2nd battery that was part of Fort Fremont. This is Battery Fornance. Was named for Army officer that was actually killed during the Spanish-American War during the Battle of San Juan Hill. Battery Fornance mounted 2 British-made 4.72-inch Armstrong quick-fire guns. They were called quick-fire because they were loaded with a complete cartridge, and in time of action, they could fire 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The purpose of Battery Fornance was to defend the minefield, which was the other component of the Endicott Coast Artillery or Coast Defense System. A minefield with controlled mines, controlled meaning that they were connected electrically to shore and could be fired on command from shore. That control station would have been probably shared with the plotting room. And in order to protect the minefield, obviously an enemy would want to interfere with that, might send vessels, small ships in here at night to try to interfere, and this battery would take those vessels under fire if there was suspected that they were doing something to interfere with the mines, such as pulling up the cables and cutting those.
The Endicott era fort was a formidable technology. It represented state-of-the-art technology, defense technology of its time against the state-of-the-art threat, which would be the battleship.
The life for the soldiers at Fort Fremont was disciplined and regimented. They even had meal times were specified lengths of time, 15 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes at breakfast, 20 minutes at supper. They had to practice their skills. They were training and doing maintenance constantly. If you can imagine, with these big guns, they had to have skills and practice the skills in artillery, mine laying, signaling, which involved, in our case at Fort Fremont, the use of the fire control tower, which was a pretty sophisticated and advanced signaling technique. Then they also had to practice the typical military skills, marching and drilling, small arms fire, first aid, and so forth. In addition to that, they also participated in athletics. They had physical training, PT, and they also had sports teams. So this was to keep them physically fit so that they could continue their duties, because it was pretty rigorous at Fort Fremont.
When eventually the decision was made to move the dry dock and the coaling station and the Navy station up to Charleston, then this fort no longer became significant. There was nothing left here that was to be protected. And at that point, 1911, the last troops were transferred out and the fort was closed.
In 1901, the mayor of Charleston and the United States Senator Pitchfork Ben Tillman from South Carolina wanted this to move from Beaufort County to Charleston County, because there are more votes in Charleston County, and the mayor wanted the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the Navy to dredge the harbor in Charleston, because battleships in those days required 26 feet of water. Charleston's natural harbor is 15 feet of water. Port Royal is 30 feet of water. In order for Charleston to sustain its port, its commercial port, it had to dredge the harbor. Well, if they could get the Navy up there, they get the Corps of Engineers to dredge the harbor. That was the play. And the play for Pitchfork Ben Tillman, the U.S. Senator in 1900, was that he'd get a whole lot more votes from the largest city in South Carolina. So it was a political, commercial operation, and they moved the nation, and it was done, boom, like that.
The The fort did its job. It was a deterrent for anybody that wished to attack these. It provided protection. In fact, the whole Endicott system, although never challenged in this era here in the United States, provided some 300 major guns, coastal guns to protect major areas, and left the United States at the beginning of the 20th century with as well-defended coastline as any place in the world.
I would just like to say that it's a magnificent artifact of an era. And it's an era that has been neglected. The turn of the 20th century, the naval station across the river here. And so it's a piece of history that's disappearing, and the Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have preserved it for the use of the public and as a memorial to that moment in history.
Fort Fremont closes a 350-year story of homeland security addressing European imperialism in the 19th century. It's a tale of how geography, technology, and national security creates a transition for America to become a global power. It's also a wonderful snapshot of America in the beginning of the 20th century. The Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have a valued partnership working in tandem to preserve the fort's integrity and promote the historical, natural, and cultural aspects of the fort. Most important, we are always looking for creative ways to enhance the visitor experience.